Okay, artists, today we are going to do something called an oil pastel resist. So we're going to draw something with oil pastels, and then we are going to add watercolor right over top of it, so that way the water resists the oil pastel. It's going to be a really cool effect. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to start with oil pastels. The oil pastels are going to be used without pencil. So you have to be brave, you have to take a risk, and we are not drawing in pencil first. So if you draw something that you think is a mistake, you have to learn how to make it into something that works. So we are going to start by drawing a jellyfish. And I want you to use warm colors for your jellyfish. And if you remember, warm colors are things like reds, oranges, yellows, and pinks. So we're going to use those warm colors to draw our jellyfish. So I want to draw one nice big jellyfish in the middle of my paper, and then I can maybe later add smaller jellyfish around it. So I'm going to start with my pink oil pastel, and I'm going to kind of just plan out first. So I'm kind of showing myself, where is that jellyfish body going to go? And I'm imagining that I'm going to draw the head of that jellyfish right here. So I'm going to start with a semicircle or a half circle. And it's okay if my jellyfish is not perfect. The world would be a very boring place if all of our artwork looked exactly the same. After I draw that half circle, which is going to be the top part of the jellyfish, I need to maybe draw some wavy lines that's kind of curved and wavy to show the bottom part of my jellyfish. And then I'm going to go inside of my jellyfish, and I'm just kind of doing some long oval shapes, maybe 3 or 5. An odd number is always a good idea when you are drawing. So now that I have the shape of my jellyfish, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add some color. But here's what I want you to do. If you think about a jellyfish is transparent, which means you can see through a jellyfish. So when you are coloring in your jellyfish, I don't want you to push so hard that you can't see the white paper anymore. I want you to be able to see some of that white paper underneath of our oil pastel. So I'm not pushing very hard. I want to be able to see through my jellyfish. So I am coloring in my jellyfish without pushing very hard. Now those other areas, those details that I put on the head of my jellyfish or on the body of my jellyfish, I can color those in a little bit harder because we don't need those areas to be transparent. So I can go back in and I can color those in. And the cool thing about oil pastels is that you can mix colors really easily. So if I go back in with a red now and I carefully just put a little bit of red in some of my areas, it'll make my jellyfish look like it has depth. And I can go back in and I can put my red right on top of my pink areas, and they will kind of blend together. So now that I have the body of my jellyfish, I need to add some tentacles. And some of my tentacles can just kind of look like wavy lines. Maybe some are short and some are long. So some look like they're coming from behind my jellyfish and some are in front. And some can actually be kind of thick. And I can color in those thick jellyfish tentacles. Once again, I can go back in if I want and add some red detail to some of my jellyfish tentacles. The fun thing about oil pastels is how easily they mix together. So now that I have one jellyfish, I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to do maybe 2 little baby jellyfish, so I have a total of 3 jellyfish on my paper. So I have finished my jellyfish. I have 3 jellyfish and I made them kind of look like they're swimming, so they're not even. Now what I need to do is, if I think about maybe what's underwater in an ocean or where I might find a jellyfish, I could think about maybe some seaweed or some green, maybe leaves or underwater plants that could kind of come up. So I can go ahead and pick out some greens, and I'm just going to maybe, I don't want to completely fill in my background, but in just some areas I can draw some shapes that maybe resemble some seaweed or underwater plant life. And some can be kind of tall, some can be kind of short. I'm drawing this with my dark green oil pastel, and then I think I can go back in with my lighter green and color those in. So I'm just gonna draw some seaweed or underwater leaves. And I want these green underwater plants to be completely colored in, because usually an underwater plant is not transparent. So I'm really taking my time to color those in nice and bold. I don't want any of the white paper showing through like I allowed with my jellyfish. So I can just put my light green oil pastel and my dark green oil pastel. I can layer them, so I can put one right over top of the other, and I'm going to try really hard to fill those in so that no white paper is showing in there. So the last thing that I want to do with oil pastel, if I think about an underwater ocean scene, usually when you have creatures breathing underwater, you might see bubbles. And this is going to be hard for you to see because our paper is white and our oil pastel is white. But I want you to just kind of take a minute and give yourself some white circles or dots, just kind of all around your background, filling up that space. I'm doing some that are filled in completely, and I'm doing some that are just circles. And it is going to be hard for you to see where these have been drawn. Once we're done with our oil pastel, our next step is to use watercolor. So if you think about what you might learn in science, these are oil pastels, and we are going to be using watercolor. Now, if you know anything about oil and water, it doesn't mix. So what do you think might happen if we put watercolor on top of oil pastel? What do you think might happen? Do you think that our watercolor will mix with our oil pastel? Or do you think something else might happen? Let's give it a try. So I'm going to teach you a word. It's a technique. It's called wet on wet. So right now we have dry paper, and our watercolor paint needs water. So our watercolor paint is going to be wet, and right now our paper is dry. A watercolor technique that you're going to learn today is called wet on wet. So before we even use our blue watercolor paint to show the ocean underneath, I need to get my paper wet. So I have a yogurt container, just has water in it. I'm going to dip my brush just in the water, so only water, nothing else. And I am going to brush it right onto my paper. So I am making my paper wet, and I'm going to do this just a little area at a time. If I try to make my whole paper wet right now, it might dry before my next step. So right now I have wet paper. Now I'm going to get some water on my brush, and I am going to put it right into my blue watercolor paint. Now I have wet paint with wet paper, and if I just touch my blue watercolor, which is wet, right on top of my wet paper, you will notice that the watercolor is not sticking to the oil pastel. That is because it is creating a resist. Oil and water do not mix. So I'm going to keep repeating. I need to wet my paper here. So water, wet, brush. There was a little bit of blue paint on my brush still, so it's kind of tinted blue, and that's okay. Now I get water on my brush to get watercolor. So both are wet, and I am touching where the paper is wet. And now you will really see those white circles and dots that we created to show bubbles, because that is oil pastel. And so our watercolor is resisting. I'm going to take a minute and finish adding watercolor to my wet paper. Okay, artists, I have finished adding watercolor paint onto my wet paper. I now have a wet on wet watercolor resist. I used oil pastels with watercolor. The areas where I left the white paper showing, I can see the blue paint through there, so it helps my jellyfish look like they are transparent, because we know that you can see through a jellyfish in the water. And all of the areas that I completely covered in with oil have not had any resist.